Mr. Birdie, members of the board, we do have several items for board discussion this evening. Our first item is our book study, Dare to Lead by Dr. Brene Brown. If you remember, at the beginning, or I don't know, August, September, sometime around there, we decided we would do a book study this year. And at the request of the board, we kept it simple in terms of not asking specific questions, but rather having prompts. I read, I noticed, and I wondered. So those are our prompts for this evening. Again, tonight we're here to discuss pages 1 through 69. We have had the same process with our principals and some of our other administrators across the district as well. So at this point, we'll just kind of open it up to discussion, open the floor, and again, I read, I noticed, I wondered. I'll have a wait for a pause, and if no one wants to go first, I'll give it some time. I've been trained in wait time. We've all educators been trained in wait time, so.
This is a suggestion, Mr. Shorter. If you'd like to go first, then feel free to go if you'd like to.
Okay, sure. I really enjoyed the book so far. I think it's changed my attitude about what it means to be vulnerable and vulnerability. So I'm going to just start with a quote that I thought was really good. The courage to be vulnerable is not about winning or losing. It's about the courage to show up when you can't predict or control the outcome. I think that is very important because that's a part of being vulnerable. You're basically opening yourself up and you're allowing yourself to accept those slings and arrows that may come, because a part of this vulnerability in leadership is basically you're learning how to serve others. You're learning how to take those risks. You're learning how to open the doors, open those channels so that your ability to be effective in reaching others is better. So that was the first quote that I wanted to just start off with. I did take my notes through the section because I've watched my kids do this so much. I'm like, so I need to do this too. I had to set this example. So I just picked out some different points that I thought were really good. So one of the items from the introduction, when people are afraid of being put down or ridiculed for trying something or failing, or even for putting forward a radical new idea, the best you can expect is status quo and groupthink. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's really, really powerful, because this whole idea of being vulnerable actually leads to greater creativity, greater expression. So that idea of being vulnerable means that you might have some criticism, but that's a part of the growth process. So I won't keep going on.
I can go next because I'm like the opposite end of the spectrum. Mine's all just notes in my book. I don't have any typed up book report for you, but I did find it just as compelling. So there was a lot about courage that struck me, obviously. There was a quote on page 10 that said, "Courage and fear are not mutually exclusive. Most of us feel brave and afraid at the same time. We feel vulnerable." And I definitely knew that at least in my life, the moments that I have been the most courageous are also the moments that I've been the most fearful. I think everybody feels that way. And I guess I never tied it to the word vulnerability. I never put those two together, so it was kind of powerful to learn to uncover that. And then I also loved, they had the definition of a leader, which to me sounded very, very much like a teacher. She said, "I define a leader as anyone who takes responsibility for finding the potential in people and let me look at the actual quote because my notes are not typed up, so I must have miswrote something. I define a leader as anyone who takes responsibility for finding the potential in people and processes and who has the courage to develop that potential. And to me, that felt exactly what a teacher's job really is to do, is to take responsibility for finding the potential in their students and the courage to develop that potential to its fullest. And I don't think we often think of teachers as leaders, but that's how she defined a leader. And to me, it was very parallel to what we expect out of our teachers.
Good.
Very nice.
Okay.
I'll go next. So I echo those thoughts on the whole fear and the courage, and it was really, it was good. That whole first chapter talks so much about vulnerability, and vulnerability breeding trust, I thought was important as well. But then vulnerability for the sake of vulnerability isn't really what we're attempting to do there. So I thought that was great. The second chapter talked a lot about, where she relayed some different stories and talking about her time and effectiveness. And I thought that was a great payoff, where she only had 2 hours and she wanted her husband to landscape the front yard before the party. But she also had some stories along the way that included the military, speaking before them, and those were touching and moving as well. I think it's going to be a great book. She talks about being able to teach in the future chapters, teach leadership, and so very much looking forward to it.
Mrs. Gundry,
Well, it caught my attention right away because even though we weren't, I think, assigned the note section in the front, where she had the quote from Theodore Roosevelt, where he was talking about the man in the arena. I read that on a day I needed it. And if nobody has heard it before, because I had never heard it before, I had never read that before, it says, "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly." So I became totally obsessed with that quote, because I think at some point we all have those moments in your career and life where you feel like you just hear criticism everywhere from people who don't know the situation that you're in or what you do on a daily basis or how you do your job, things like that. So that really spoke to me. And actually, I learned that LeBron James writes that on his shoes. The man in the arena, he writes it on the side of his shoes, which I found very interesting. So that meant a lot to me, and I like how she kept tying back to that throughout the section. I also like the part where she said courage is courageous, or it's contagious, excuse me, because it is. Sometimes people don't speak up. They don't put themselves out there. They don't put new ideas out there or be vulnerable because they're afraid. But once they do, other people feel more free to speak their minds or propose other ideas too, which I thought was really interesting. And I am wondering what the values section is next. I'm ready to read it, ready to get into it. I want to learn more about that. So I think it's great so far.
Well, I actually had trouble in the very beginning getting into the book, mainly because I'm not a leisurely reader. It's just not who I am. So that was a little bit of my vulnerability, is that I'm not a reader, so I had to read things 2 or 3 times, and I think actually that helped me understand it. But I agree, the whole thing about the arena, that once I got to that part, I was like, okay, this is going to be great. And when she referred back to it on page 20, and if you're not in the arena getting your butt kicked on occasion, I'm not interested in or open to your feedback. So I think that speaks a lot. There's a lot of things out there on social media and things that people say that they don't understand what we understand, and the information that we get, even though it's available to them, they're not interested in getting that information. And so I think it's easy for us, or it's hard for us to ignore that, but reading that, it hopefully now will be easier to ignore those comments and not, take them to personally. I marked up this book like Carrie did. I was dog earing. I'm like, do I want to dog ear it or do I want to put a card in there? And I'll start putting business cards on pages and then the book get like that thick. I'm like, yeah, that's not going to work anymore. So I just started dog earing the page and then highlighting. And I hope we don't have to turn these back in because
You get to keep them.
But, I mean, there are just so many great quotes. I mean, where do you start? And I read the part about starting where people are. I thought, wow, that's what we kind of do here. We educate kids where they are. You know, I mean, we meet them where they are and try to bring them along at a pace that they can go. And so that really struck, you know, to the heart. And then we have the CDA presentation tonight. And then I read the part where Carrie quoted about kids putting on their armor. And it's great to have a place for them to come where they can take that armor off, because they may not be able to take it off at home, and they may not be able to take it off on the way to school. But if the school environment gives them the opportunity to take their armor off and be who they are, they can feel included and they can feel alive. And so that struck a good chord. So I'm thoroughly enjoying this book. Like I said, the first couple of pages, I was like, oh my gosh, it's just going to take me forever to read this because I have to keep going back. But, you know, once I got into the meat of it, it's so much easier to read because I was understanding it. And I think it's great that it talks about, you know, being able to be in a group where you can feel vulnerable and speak your truth. And they haven't used those words, but I think speak your truth, and that as leaders, we have to understand that people come from different areas and that we need to listen to what they have to say and understand that that is where they're coming from, and not be, you know, shaking our head or rolling our eyes like, oh my gosh, you know, like we have to present a culture with ourselves to listen to what each of us have to say and understand that you do have a voice. So I thought that was really great too. So.
I do have one more thing that, because you brought it up. So I actually sent you a picture of
Yeah.
part of the book, and it happened to be the day that the Butler Tech Symposium,
Right.
had happened. And I read a piece at night that reminded me exactly of that and took a picture and sent it to him. And that's what you're kind of talking about, taking
Yeah.
your armor off. And so if you go back to the part, the I wondered part, ... I won't read this whole passage to you, but it did talk about creating an environment that you could take your armor off. And I had just come from Butler Tech and witnessed what that looks like when kids feel safe to take their armor off, and was, without even kind of realizing, it was just in awe of seeing the safe space that those kids were living in. And I don't feel like we always create that same space here in Fairfield High School. You don't walk into kids being as eager or available or safe to take those risks. And I don't know the answer. I wonder and I question, what is it that, how does Butler Tech, at least what I witnessed, how do they create that safe space? And it just left me with that question mark, because it was beautiful to witness. And I thought it isn't something that I think the kids necessarily at this school, not in every single classroom, feel. And I wonder how you create that.
I think we're starting to do a good job with that at Fairfield, you know, with AXO, with reaching out to the different diverse groups. They're starting to start their own clubs, things like that. I think in a classroom, it's difficult because we don't group the kids here at Fairfield by what is their interest.
Right, I think that
Where
is
at
the
Butler
difference.
Tech, you're in a classroom based on what is your interest.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's very difficult to do in any kind of school setting that's not oriented towards a particular talent.
Yeah.
But say in the marching band room, in the
Right,
choral
those
room.
probably are safe.
You know, kids that take engineering classes here at the school, kids that are in AXO, kids that are on the football team. When they're around kids that have the same interests that they have, that environment does thrive. And so it's difficult in an instruction day when, you know, not everybody's interested in geometry,
Right.
not everybody's interested in history, but they do have to take those classes. And so
Right.
that's the drawback or the difference, is that it's difficult to, but once they're in those environments that they are very interested in here at Fairfield, you do have that culture of, I can take my arm off and be who I want to be. I can be in the book club. I can be on the academic team. I can be on the volleyball team. You know, I can
Which
be on the
goes
chess
back
club.
to why it's so important to have all those extracurriculars and those the arts and the sports and
Right.
the AXO and all of that, because at least that does create a space where you can
Right.
take that armor off.
I mean, even the kids that are in the pit, right?
Right,
For
sure, sure.
plays that never get seen have that
Yeah,
culture,
yeah.
so.
Well, a section that reminded me of our early work with the CDA. This was in the introduction, and I think we basically had a great example of how doing this thing will lead you to a great place. So the quote was, "People are opting out of vital conversations about diversity and inclusivity because they fear looking wrong, saying something wrong, or being wrong. Choosing our own comfort over hard conversations is the epitome of privilege, and it corrodes trust and moves us away from meaningful and lasting change." So when we started out with the CDA all those years ago, we basically had to do just this.
Yeah.
We had those courageous conversations just to get to a point where we could, like, get a common language and start to move forward. And I think we're finally seeing basically the rewards of all of that. You guys have carried through and you've made the program blossom. But this particular quote, I think that is so important for any organization that's starting out where they're dealing with issues of, how do you get to a point where you're great with diversity, you're inclusive. I think she's absolutely right, and that really caught my attention because there is something about being in your own comfort zone and choosing to stay in that comfort zone. And so the vulnerability and stepping outside of that basically means that you're opening yourself up to these things that can come from that, the growth that can come from that. And I really love that. I really like this whole theme of rumbling with
Yeah.
vulnerability. I think that's awesome. So she talks about creating the space in classrooms where all students can walk in, and for that day they can take off their armor, just as you mentioned. And I mean, I think the book really has a lot of insightful parts that if you just read it and take your armor off, there's so much you can get out of it. And I'm definitely enjoying it, the myths of vulnerability, I've basically have believed some of those. So one of the myths is that vulnerability itself is weakness. Myth 2 is I don't do vulnerability. I can go it alone. You can engineer the uncertainty and discomfort out of vulnerability. And trust comes before vulnerability. Oh, one more. Vulnerability is disclosure. And she does address that. She addresses that whole myth of vulnerability being disclosure. So that doesn't mean you have to show up and tell everybody. You don't just dump every single thing that is your deepest secret or whatever. In fact, she even talks about one particular leader who very seldom shared any specific information, but he was masterful at being a daring leader, somebody that was very effective at being able to empathize. So it's really a good book. I enjoyed the section about the soldier. Well, she's actually a lieutenant. Was she a lieutenant?
Yeah, she was pretty high ranking.
She was pretty high ranking, maybe a commander.
DD something,
Yeah, and when she talks about the time that she asked her squad, how are you guys feeling? And all these soldiers in the Air Force talked about being tired. And so she didn't stop there. She decided, I'm just going to keep on going. Let me put into practice what she had learned from Dr. Brown. And so she decided to drill a little bit deeper, and she asked the question, well, are you really tired? Because if you're tired, I'll send you home. And she asked, are you lonely? And so when she asked that question, like 15 of these airmen put up their hands because they were actually lonely. They weren't tired, they were actually lonely, but for military people to admit that type of thing and to be vulnerable and say that, that could be taken as a sign of weakness. But because she was able to probe and ask the question outside of the standard hardcore, rugged individualism or whatever, she was able to get something very important. And so just learning how to be more sensitive and getting the right language together, that's what I'm getting from the book. And I really recommend it. I'm looking forward to the rest of it.
Anybody else? Mr. Smith, you want to chime in?
Sure, any of us can chime in. I just really enjoyed listening to the five of you banter back and forth, and I love how you apply that, how can we create that safe place for kids, and you talk specifically about the high school, and I can relate to your perception. So I can tell you, I used to make it a point to stand in the cafeteria every morning and say good morning to our students as they walk by, and some students, good morning, Mr. Smith, and they're so happy, and then others, they didn't want me to say good morning. They had the armor on, and they didn't want to make eye contact, and I just got the feeling that, it just broke my heart to feel like they went through the majority of their day that way, because I would see them at other times, and again, they would have their heads down in the hallway, and we always talked about as a staff, we want every student, and you're talking about over 2,000 that comes through the door, we want it to be a safe place for them, a place where they do feel protected, where they feel a part of a family, and that is one of the biggest challenges of a large school. But again, it really does go back to all of those extracurricular opportunities, all those clubs, and every year at orientation, when we were talking to students and parents, we would say, hey, find something. Please find some way to get plugged in, to get connected to the school, so you can make friends and feel like a part of something smaller, get into like a small group of some kind. So, yeah, you took me back a few years when you made that observation. A couple things I'll just share. I'll keep it brief. Belina, I can relate to all of your comments, but Belina, you talked early on about being vulnerable and opening yourself up. And sometimes I feel like we try to do that, but then sometimes we want to pick and choose the feedback that we receive and not give credit to some of it or acknowledge some of it because it might be hurtful. And so I see that a lot. For me, and I think it may have been pages 19, 21, there were some pretty powerful words for me personally. Don't grab hurtful comments and pull them close to you by rereading them and ruminating on them. It goes on to say, no matter how much your self-doubt wants to scoop up the criticism and snuggle with the negativity so it can confirm its worst fears, or how eager the shame gremlins are to use the hurt to fortify your armor, take a deep breath and find the strength to leave what's mean-spirited on the ground. And that's hard to do sometimes, because when you're a pleaser and when you're a server, you want everyone to be pleased and satisfied with their experiences. And so you take those criticisms personally and you dissect them and you let them go, but then you circle back to them 3 hours later and again the next day. So that really hit home for me, because that's a challenge. So, but I also have enjoyed the book and look forward to carrying on. But it's nice to sit back and listen to you guys as a group discuss it as well.
I don't mean to tell you to tattoo that on your body, but that would be a good one if there was one that you were going to make permanent. You could use, so that's a good one.
Yeah, that is a good one.
Take it for your whole forearm.
It would, yeah.
You had to pick a small part.
I'm glad you mentioned that part, because that was one part that spoke to me too, but I couldn't find it when I was trying to mark things up. And when she talks about picking it up and snuggling with it, I'm thinking it's an insecurity blanket. That's what it is.
Yeah.
So, and I think a lot of people have that. You try something new and there's, this little nagging doubt you have, like, what if I fail? But you just gotta push through it. And it's, I have a friend who, she used to say, don't give somebody free rent in your head.
Right.
And I would catch myself doing that a lot, like, well, so-and-so was mean to me on the phone, and I should say this, I should have said this, I should have said, and before you know it, I'm giving them free rent in my head. So that passage reminded me of that.
Because if you use her strategies, one of her Rumble tool strategies, make your squad. I thought that was really good.
Really good.
So, yeah, I've made my square squad. And, and really thinking about the people that I put on the list, it was, some of them are obvious, yeah, like parents, but I really did want to take her advice, and I didn't want to have a yes section. I want that person that's going to really just say, wait a minute, Belina, no ma'am. And I thought, okay, now. I'm like, okay, yeah, I know exactly who would give me that kind of feedback. I do think that that's important, because this whole idea of the shame gremlins, they're out there. They're real. So you don't want to give into the negativity over that, but have that square squad and the people that you really value. You value their opinion of you. You value their opinion in general, and they will tell you the truth. They will keep it real with you and keep you centered. So that's a tool that I'm using. I recommend it just to see who's there, who's really in your little small squad, because it's a small 1 inch, what is it, 1 inch by 1 inch? So that's tiny. You can't get a lot of people on that.
You have to write really small.
Yeah, unless you write super small, right? Yeah.
Mrs. Lane, would you like to?
Well, I'm a little late to the party, but it was interesting because the same ideas that came from the book that you all talked about were some of the things that we talked about at our administrative meeting. It was the same exact topics that we talked about. So I think it's just interesting that we're all kind of on the same page.
I think it's very timely that we're reading this book with the things that are going on. So I'm very interested to see what comes next, and hopefully have some downtime in the next couple of days to be able to get right back into it, because it's been a few days since I've read it, and I'm like, I need to get back into it. So, any other questions or any more discussion?
Just one little thing.
Yeah.
To love is to be vulnerable. That's page 22 or something like that. But I think that's an important takeaway.
And I also like the chicken and the egg, the trust and the vulnerability. What comes first? It's like, that's true. I mean, you don't think about it, but you have to trust someone to be vulnerable to them, but you have to be vulnerable for them to trust you. So it's something to think about. So what's our next, do you have it in front of you, what our next?
Yeah, I'm looking, this is I know in March.
March 5th, I think.
Yeah, because I know March 17th is all administrator.
March 5th, it says we discuss pages 70 to 152.
There you have it. There it
Okay.
is. That's at a work session. That is correct.
Sounds great. Well, thank you all very much for participating. I think this is going to be one of our great goals that we set for ourselves, to move ourselves forward as leaders in our community. So thank you all very much.
All right.
Okay, Mr. Smith, the next item?
Our next item for board discussion is board policy, and I'll turn it over to Ms. Gentry Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. You have a copy of a new policy, KJA, distribution of materials in the schools, in your board packet. We currently don't have this policy in our books, and we had two versions that the OSBA provided for us to consider. We decided to go with version 1, which best suits our needs. It provides more detail about what we will permit to be distributed in schools and who's responsible for approving those requests. Under the prior approval required heading, we changed the language a bit so that the school and community relations director or her or his designee now reviews, approves, or denies requests instead of the superintendent. One of the reasons we did that was just to kind of take something off of his plate, so I'm trying to have your back a little bit, Billy. So we eliminated wording under manner and mode of distribution as well. We felt that that was unnecessary, and we added some language that the school and community relations director or designee would provide the approval notice and instructions for distributing or bringing any kind of materials to the schools. And this includes wording that they are required to create, copy, and deliver to the schools using their own resources. The items must be delivered to the schools 5 days prior to the requested date to go home with students. And it also states that our distribution of the materials does not imply a sponsorship or an endorsement by the district, and that we're not responsible for any issues that arise after the distribution has been completed. I'll be bringing this back for your approval at a future board meeting. I don't have a date because we have to wait until you guys come up with the 2020 board meeting dates, and then we'll get it back on there. So, do you have any questions?
Any questions for Mrs. Gina Gentry-Fletcher? I do have just one. This is not really about the policy as much as if someone gives you material that you approve, does it come to the district office and then you send it out? Or do they take it to the school building that they want it to go to?
There are a couple of things that they can do. If they want it to be included in the parent email announcements, they can just send me the verbiage that they want to include, and then I send it on to the schools. They are responsible for any copies that they need to have sorted out, but they are responsible for taking those copies or those materials to the schools. We do not do that. We will do it with certain partnerships, but very rarely.
So what kind of assurances do we have as a school that what you approved is what they're dropping off to the building?
Well, they have to have the approval letter that I send them with attached to whatever the material is. If they do not have that letter, our staff members have been very diligent in the schools. They will call me and say, hey, I received this, it doesn't have your approval, I just wanted to make you aware, is this something that I need to hand out? And if I don't have it in my file, then I tell them we don't hand it out, and we contact them.
So is there like a check and balance that they send you a copy of what's
Yes.
in there, and then you can say, yes, I did approve that?
Keep a file.
Even if they have the letter, they could just put that letter on top of whatever they want,
Anything.
right?
Exactly.
So it is something that they scan back to you, and you
Yes.
can, okay, that's
I have to
great.
see it before I can approve it, so, and I keep a copy, an electronic file, and if it's a hard copy, typically if they fax something to me, I will keep a file of that as well, so.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Our next item for board discussion, electricity supplier update. I'll turn it over to Mr. Penny.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. This evening, I have excellent news to share with the board regarding a considerable decrease in our electricity supply costs. We have entered an agreement with a new supplier, Constellation Energy, which begins in May 2020 and lasts 36 months. Our electricity supply rate will decrease from 4.75 cents per kilowatt hour to 4.357 cents per kilowatt hour. So based on historical annual power usage, we project a savings of approximately $144,000 over the life of the 36-month contract. That's my update for this evening.
Any questions or comments for Mr. Penny? Great job.
Yeah, great.
All right, next we have additional school psychologists for 2021. I'll turn it over to Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. We don't usually begin talking about staffing needs for next school year until about February, but Kathy Gilbert, our Director of Special Services, brought a need to us the other day at team, and we decided to bring it to you here tonight in the board meeting just for discussion. We need an additional school psychologist next year. This year, many of our school psychologists, their workloads are over what they should have. And there is a set timing for when a student is to be tested for an IEP. There are a certain number of days that they have to test the students, and we don't want to become uncompliant. We want to remain in compliance with all of that. So we are recommending the hiring of an additional school psychologist for next school year. Another reason we wanted to bring it early, school psychologists are very difficult to find, and we have an excellent school psych intern with us this year that is a person of color as well, which is awesome. And we want to let that person know early on in the year as well that we would be interested in interviewing them for the position. The person is doing an outstanding job with us as a psych intern. So we wanted to bring it to you early on so that we could move forward with that if it's your pleasure.
How many school psychologists do we have on staff now?
Oh, I do not know the answer to that. I can send that out to you tomorrow.
And they're not school-specific, do they service like all the schools?
They won't be, they're every spring, they all meet together and they get their assignments for the following year based on the number of students with special needs in each building. There are many of our school psychs that split buildings. Some have even gone to 3 buildings, but we try to keep it limited to 2. So it would be adjusting some of the locations that would be done in the spring. But just the caseloads itself necessitate that we do need an additional person for next year. I can send that out to you tomorrow, Mr. Bakley, the number we have in our district.
Is there any objections?
I believe that position will be paid for by grant money.
That's right. It will be out of IDEA funds. Yeah, so it won't be out of our general funding. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Nancy.
Okay, sounds good, thank you.
All right. Our last item for board discussion is Ed Choice Scholarship Voucher Program Resolution. You should have a resolution in your folder, and in a few minutes I'll read that aloud since it isn't on the actual agenda this evening. Before I read that agenda or read that resolution aloud, just like to give an update to the board in terms of, last time we talked about some of the things we would be doing. And I know some of you have been involved in, obviously communicating with our legislators, keeping a close tab on what's going on. Nancy and I have been very busy, and Mandy has been joining us from time to time on some of those meetings as well. But we talked about educating our community, creating a fact sheet. We've put that out there. It's on our website. It's on social media. We have been collaborating with other leaders. She was with fellow treasurers today. I was with fellow superintendents. I honestly can't count. I couldn't tell you how many different meetings we've had with local superintendents and treasurers, the communications we've had with those via email, phone calls, just keeping up to date with the latest news on Ed Choice, and of course, contacting our legislators and being a voice for our school district and other public schools across the state. So we have been told and haven't been given details that there's a feeling that something is going to change. But again, we hear a different message every day. The latest we've heard was that it may not happen until the end of January. So, which would be good, at least that's prior to February 1st. But initially we were hearing, this week or next week, but again, none of that has been confirmed. We hear a lot of voices out there, so it's really hard to tell exactly what's taking place. But legislators are saying that there's something in the works, so to speak. So we're anxiously awaiting word what that might be. Which leads us to this resolution tonight. What I'd like to do is read it aloud for everyone and then give the board the opportunity to discuss it, have discussion or ask any questions before we put it before you as an item for board action. So resolution opposing the State of Ohio Ed Choice Scholarship Voucher Program Whereas the Ohio Legislature has recently made amendments which greatly increase the number and availability of vouchers for students to attend private parochial schools at public tax expense, and whereas such vouchers will be available to numerous families and students who have never attended Fairfield or any other public schools and for whom state funding has never been provided to Fairfield or any other public schools, and whereas Fairfield state funding will be unjustly decreased by the amount of the vouchers provided to such families and students who have not and will not attend public schools and others who transfer to private parochial schools. Whereas the estimated loss of revenue to the Fairfield City School District over the next 4 years is $14,530,950, which would devastate the district's finances. And whereas private parochial schools accepting students with public tax vouchers would not be required to accept all students, but would be permitted to retain their selective admission policies without appropriate enforcement of anti-discrimination and other laws applicable to public schools. And whereas private parochial school students are not subject to the testing standards required of public school students, so that the actual performance of private parochial schools subsidized with public tax dollars will be unknown. And whereas this board believes that the EdChoice voucher program as it currently exists presents serious constitutional issues regarding the separation of church and state and the funding of religious institutions with public tax dollars. And whereas the state of Ohio has the constitutional responsibility to secure a thorough and efficient system of common schools, and whereas the EdChoice voucher program will have exactly the opposite effect by providing funding to private parochial schools at the expense and to the detriment of public schools and their students. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the Fairfield City School District Board of Education that this board reaffirms its commitment to free, accessible public schools which are adequately and equitably funded to guarantee a comparable education for all children, and therefore opposes and respectfully requests the repeal of the ill-conceived EdChoice voucher program of the state of Ohio. Be it further resolved that this board opposes any funding programs, vouchers or otherwise, that have the effect of diverting public tax dollars from public schools or to private parochial schools. Be it further resolved that the treasurer is hereby authorized and directed to forward copies of this resolution to all Ohio State legislators, the superintendent of public instruction, and the governor of the state of Ohio. So at this time, I'd like to give the board the opportunity to have any discussion around that resolution, or the EdChoice program in general, obviously.
Mr. Shorter?
Thank you. The resolution reads very well. I do have a question about the statement on page 2 at the top. I'm wondering if we need to clarify that a bit more. So it's whereas private parochial students, school students are not subject to testing standards required of public school students, so that the actual performance of private parochial schools subsidized with public tax dollars will be unknown. I'm wondering if we should probably look at that a little bit more. I went to ODE. Now they do, per state law, they do provide some test data for kids that are currently on the Cleveland voucher program as well as EdChoice. But the data is kind of a, as an aggregate thing. It's for the schools that do participate. I don't know the structure of those tests. So are we saying that we want the test to be the exact same that we're taking? I'm just wondering if what they're doing right now, just to extend that out to any private school kids that take those public dollars. I would think even with the scholarships, those kids, their scores would have to be listed. They are listed now for EdChoice and Cleveland scholarship kids. So are they in fact fulfilling that, or do we want to go further with that or clarify it?
So, I mean, what we're talking about there, what we're addressing in that statement is the fact that is a reference to that public schools have state report cards.
Right.
And because according to the state report card system, we have schools that are quote-unquote underperforming.
So it's a rating.
Yeah, but these private and parochial schools, they do not receive state report cards. And so that's kind of what we're referencing there. And John, I don't know if there's
No,
a different way you want to say it, or.
That's my understanding, is that they are not, I shouldn't say the students aren't tested, but I don't believe they're tested and evaluated in the same way that they are under the state report card.
Right.
So I'm not exactly sure how, if this is successful, anyone will know how successful those public dollars are being spent in those institutions that aren't graded and measured in the same way as public schools. So that's the point of it. If there's a better way to say it, I'm happy
Well,
to try to wordsmith something.
I mean, they do give the number of kids that, or the percentage of kids that scored at least proficient for those schools. I'm just wondering, would that sort of be enough? Because, because a parent can go to this website and they can look at how voucher kids are, or kids that have vouchers are performing now. And I mean, I'm looking at LaSalle as an example, and on all tests, both English and math, only 30% were proficient. So, I mean, is that the type of data that we?
There is
that
some
not
data
totally
out there. So I
compared?
read an article last night. It was a study about some data that's out there, but you can't find a state report card. If you go to ODE's website and you look under state report card data and you type in
Yeah.
the parochial schools, it's not there.
Right, it's not in the state report card format, just as ours is. But they do give them, they give them state tests for English as well as math, and they do list how they perform on all those. And they publish it on the website. For any school that receives that Ed Choice money, for any student that receives it. And I'm wondering if that is, so we want them to have the exact same structure as far as the exact state card, report card measure. Okay.
Would it read a little better if it said, so that the actual performance of private parochial schools subsidized with public tax dollars will not be known relative to the performance of public schools? So that what we're saying is,
Yeah.
there isn't an apples and apples
Yes, yeah.
comparison.
Yeah, I think if you just kind of word it like that, you'd get more of the details in there, what the specific thing is, because we want it to be apples to apples.
Okay. I mean, that's an easy, I kind of scratched it out here, and the board's comfortable with that. We can consider that.
How's the rest of the
revised.
board feel about that?
I'm fine with
Okay
that.
with
I mean, that is, we do want to clarify, it's not apples to apples right now.
Right. Okay, yeah, I think if you just wordsmith a little bit more to talk about the state report card and the words that you choose to,
Okay, well, we're gonna adopt this here later on, so we need to get
Okay.
I
to
think-
what we're exactly comfortable with here.
So if I heard correctly,
I
it's,
can get the word report card in there
well,
somewhere.
you want the word report card, or you just
or
want?
a state
will?
evaluation system, or, because if they change the name from report card to something else, then
Yeah,
Is it really the state testing standards?
to the state report card accountability system? I don't
Well,
know.
that's, will not be known relative to public school evaluation standards.
An equivalent evaluation standard, because, we don't know for sure if these are the same tests, similar information. We don't have that information. We just know that they're listed. But I think if you have something that says that, it's an equivalent standard or something like that.
Well, it would say then not be known relative to equivalent public school evaluation standards.
Yes.
So whatever measuring sticks are being used on private parochial schools are not being used on public schools. They have a more rigorous evaluation standard.
So I guess we need to come up with those exact words that paragraph will
Yeah, if
state.
I can read it, it just, instead of saying will be unknown at the end, it says will not be known relative to equivalent public school evaluation standards. So there is no report card evaluation. I don't want it, I'm like you, Michael, I don't want to call it a report card because next year it might be something else.
Right.
You took out evaluation, didn't you?
Would not be known relevant to public school evaluation standards, is that?
Equivalent public school evaluation standard.
Okay. Any other comments or questions about?
While we're talking about tattoos, I mean, I would tattoo this puppy on me. I agree with it wholeheartedly. I have a hard time seeing how the Ed Choice Scholarship Program is constitutional and legal to give those public funds to private institutions, and that it is, to me, it doesn't seem like separation of church and state. So I would love to give my approval of this.
I do have some comments, and
Sure, Ms.
I'm going to
Becker.
be vulnerable here and say that before our last meeting, I did not allow myself adequate time to fully research this program. So when we talked about it at the meeting, there was sort of like a disconnect with me about how big of a deal this is, and what a detriment it would be to the public school system. But I've had plenty of time and probably over-researched it since then. And I can see where, I think when it was originally instituted, it was meant for like the bottom 10% of schools in low-income areas. And I could see, where that would be beneficial to them, but it's basically like they've blown the barn doors off. And, I read 426 of 610 school districts are affected next year. And basically, they've called 1/3 of all public schools in Ohio as underperforming, even ones that have A's, B's, and C's. And that's just beyond belief to me. I think there's definite problems with this. That being said, as much as I agree that they need to change this, I have concerns about some of the wording in the resolution. The last paragraph on the first page, I'm certain that we don't mean it that way, but I'm afraid that that paragraph, especially where it says private or parochial schools accepting students, blah, 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 without appropriate enforcement of anti-discrimination and other laws applicable to public schools, I'm kind of afraid that could be misconstrued as we're saying that they actively discriminate.
I guess it depends on what the word discriminate.
Yeah, it's one of those gray areas, because the truth is, private schools don't accept everybody that knocks on the door. And I think the real big issue for me, I have a special needs student, and I do know for a fact that depending on the needs of the student, if they really exceed what they're able to provide, they don't have to accept that student. So public schools do. So I think that's probably what that language means. But I
It's not
guess
racial discrimination.
It's not necessarily racial discrimination, even though there are things that can track, especially if you have a socioeconomically disadvantaged student that lives in a certain area, because that's also another thing. If you're a low performer, you're not necessarily going to be, you're not guaranteed to be accepted. So my fear, you know, being from Birmingham, being a part of the civil rights Mecca, I see where this could go, and I see this as being something that creates separate and unequal. If you have public tax dollars funding two systems, whereas one takes everyone that comes through the door and the other one does not. So that's my concern, is that we're creating separate and unequal with public tax dollars. And I think that might be, you know, some people might say that there's a potential for discrimination.
I could see, I mean, I'm glad that you brought that up, because actually, one of the documents I read was a study from I think it was the Fordham Institute from 2016, that said that basically they're finding that all the people that have used the scholarship program, the majority are more well-off and higher achieving than the students that get left behind in the public schools. So I could see why you say that. To me, this wording, I think, could connotate, it could be misconstrued to say we are thinking that public school, or that private schools or parochial schools racially discriminate, or, you know, discriminate for other reasons that they're not supposed to. I see the point, but I mean, like Mr. Birding said at the last meeting, I went to private school. My parents chose that for me. I'm proud of the school I went to, but I see the value in public education. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. And I think there are a lot of other people like me who went to private school, but their kids go to public school, or even if they go to private school, they see that there's value for the whole community with public education. And I'm afraid we may be alienating the support of people like that if we leave this language in there.
I guess the question would be, what is the appropriate enforcement of anti-discrimination and other laws? What does that look like? I'm sure our legal team looked at that pretty closely. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that, Mr. Clemens?
Well, one example is that a lot of private or parochial schools require a certain adherence to religious principles. We cannot, with public dollars, require religious affiliation or acceptance.
So they could discriminate against someone because they don't believe in the same religion.
Some of them, I believe, I don't.
And vouchers
know all
could
the
go to those schools.
Policies, but I think some of them say you have to believe these religious tenets, or we will not accept you as a student. So.
Or a teacher in some
Or a
instances.
teacher. And that's what I'm saying, is public dollars should not be used in that.
Mhm. And so,
That's the point of it.
so that wording's there because some parochial schools or private schools are able to discriminate based on religious preference, whereas a public school cannot.
Right.
Okay,
That's one example.
Yeah.
But there's race, there's gender, there's national origin, there's a whole
Right.
host of requirements that public schools have to meet that I'm not sure once they give the voucher and they say you're going to a private school, I don't know who's going to enforce those laws. That's the point of this.
Yeah.
I don't think they're going to look to the use of that money and say, is it being applied indiscriminately? I don't think it will be, at least in some areas.
so, for instance, LaSalle and St. X and Elder, Mueller, they can discriminate against Mrs. O'Neill, Mrs. Gundrum, and Mrs. Shorter, because they're
Well,
female.
I think there've been, some exceptions made for just, single gender schools or whatever.
Right.
But that is part of it.
But the voucher program could go to that school, even though they are discriminating against females.
But I don't know what every private or parochial school's admission policies are, but I believe that some of them require acceptance of religious tenets
Yeah.
to be a student and to be accepted as an educator.
When I first read that
That's-
too, like,
That's the point of saying public dollars should not be used in that way.
right,
I know there's two different qualifications as spelled out on ODE's website. So I know for some parochials, if they are strict and they definitely adhere to the tenets and they sort of practice, religiosity, they're not allowed to get, they're not allowed to participate in the voucher program, I thought.
Yeah, I read the same thing.
That's what I thought, because like the other ones, I think that you have to just give assurances that you're not going to force the student to adhere to any kind of religious
Well,
practice. I thought.
Can I, s-
That's just a concern that I had in writing these words, and, I understand maybe they've tried to say, well, there's some restrictions on availability of these scholarships, but I'm not convinced that in practice, things are really not going to be de facto.
Okay. Yeah, because when I read it, I wasn't thinking, I wasn't even thinking religion. I was thinking special needs versus, just things like that. So let me catch up with it.
can I just mention one thing that, and this falls outside of the Ed Choice program. So we have 3 schools within our boundaries, so Sacred Heart, Cincinnati Christian, and Fairfield Educational Building, which just houses kindergarten. We receive state money called auxiliary funds for those individual schools. With those funds, there are parameters as to what they can spend that money on, and it cannot be used for religious purposes. So if they want to purchase a textbook, it cannot relate at all to any type of religious teachings. They can purchase computers, they could purchase iPads. They are not allowed to purchase any workbooks or anything that they use in any of those classes. So we are the fiscal agent, we hold the money for those schools to use. So we have to police that, which is kind of ironic when you look at the voucher program, that they're just going to give them money to use for whatever purpose they want. So I'm not sure that that's maybe what was part of that ODE, on ODE's website, but that's another piece to this, is that they are restricted, and we're the gatekeepers of that money to make sure they don't use it for religious purposes. So the whole voucher, it just is ironic that the voucher system doesn't have any of those type of regulations.
Well, what if we, and I'm, flexible on words here, what if it said without appropriate enforcement of other laws applicable to public schools? Take out the anti-discrimination. I mean, there are all kinds of standards that we have to meet, and I do believe that many of those standards do not apply to private schools and will not apply to private schools. So, I mean, it's a generic, that's why they're private.
Right.
Because they don't want
Everybody.
all the regulation that public schools have.
Right.
Because they have public dollars.
I would feel more comfortable, sorry, Mrs. Shorter. I would feel more comfortable with that. I just don't want people to take this as we're saying private schools, parochial schools in this area discriminate. Because I think it would be taken in a bad way, and in a way we probably don't necessarily mean. But to discuss a little further what Mrs. Shorter was saying, I did see where to qualify to be a voucher school, the school has to not discriminate based on, the major protected classes of race, religion, sex, and so on. So, and I have kind of thought to myself, how's that going to work? Because I know, I won't say which one, but I know at least one of the schools that Mrs. Lane just mentioned has a very rigorous religious part of their application process. So I'm kind of wondering, like, how does that work?
That's the de facto concern that I have. How is this going to work when these institutions are based on premises that they expect the people that go there to accept? I don't know how.
It's part of their coursework. It's part of their coursework.
I should correct myself and say historically, the one school I'm thinking of has had a pretty rigorous religious requirement for admissions, but I don't know that they currently do. I haven't checked lately.
Yeah, and I don't know if they're on the list as eligible for Ed Joyce funds or not.
They are.
So, if we just left it without appropriate enforcement of other laws applicable to public schools, because there's more than anti-discrimination.
There is, sure.
I know that, at least I saw a copy, I don't have it here, Cincinnati schools passed a resolution on this issue specifically recently, as in November. So they had those concerns. But I'm satisfied.
Do you think that it because I feel comfortable with anti-discrimination being in there, but do you feel like if we take it out, we're still covering that by saying other laws?
We're covering the point,
Okay.
but
Yeah, we're not being as
not being
blatant about it.
accusatory
Yeah,
as in
yeah.
some people's eyes. It could be read that way.
Now, along the same vein, and this may be totally on me and my misunderstanding of the term, but the very last paragraph, well, second to
Sorry,
last.
Mrs. Gunner, can I interrupt you just for 1 minute?
Yes.
I want to just make sure the board is, on that particular subject, is giving the right direction before we move on. Is that okay?
I'm so sorry, yes.
I mean, is that how, is that okay for, because we have to have the whole will of the
Right.
board, the majority of us okay with Mr. Clemens changing that wording before we approve so we're just taking out the word enforcement
Well, I
of,
think we can take out the word appropriate and just say without enforcement of other laws applicable to public schools.
without enforcement of other laws.
Would you want to say all other laws, or?
No,
No?
I wouldn't, because
Okay.
they do have to meet some standard.
Okay.
I don't have a problem with the word appropriate. Are we just taking the anti-discrimination out?
Well, I think enforcement covers everything. Just
Yeah, so
whether
just
it's
replace it.
appropriate or not, it just covers that. They have to apply to all those laws that deal with admission and non-discrimination.
Okay.
Well, the reason I was concerned about appropriate, if those laws don't apply, then enforcement would not be appropriate. But that's part of the concern too, is that the same standards are not being applied. So that's an issue in and of itself, whether the enforcement's appropriate.
Right.
That's why I was willing to take the word appropriate out, because if the laws don't apply, you can't have appropriate.
Okay. So it's going to read without enforcement of other laws.
Applicable to public school.
Okay. Is that okay with the board for it to be changed like that?
I'm okay with that.
I'm okay with it.
Okay. Mrs. Gundrum?
Okay, sorry. So the second to last paragraph, sort of in the same vein of how it, and it could be just my misunderstanding of the terminology used. where it says, "Be it further resolved that this board opposes any funding programs, vouchers, or otherwise that have the effect of diverting public tax dollars from public schools or to private/parochial schools." I am in total agreement that I would disagree, that I would oppose any funding program that diverts public tax dollars from public schools. But I guess I'm kind of wondering, what do we mean by funding programs? Because without knowing exactly what you mean by that, to me, I'm thinking like, well, there may be some reason why private schools would get public funds, so are we saying they should get zero for any reason? Or?
I'll respond what I think is what John was thinking, but John, you can correct me. So one, any funding program, so, I was thinking, if they changed programs, voucher, if they started calling it something different, but I think the key is that have the effect of diverting public tax dollars from public schools to private parochial schools. And I think by including any programs, you're saying that this board opposes any program that would take money from a public school and divert it to a private or parochial school. Is that?
Well, if you take out the word "or," which I'm okay with, then it says what Mr. Smith
Okay.
just said, and I'm fine.
And or is what threw me there, because
Okay.
it sounded like we were saying, well, private or parochial schools should get no public funds for any reason whatsoever, when I read it with the or.
Gotcha.
So it was more just
So
like
it's
an interpretation, a confusion of interpretation on my part.
It's the "or" after public schools, that's what we're taking out?
Yeah.
Tax dollars from public schools to, okay.
Is there any other thoughts, concerns, questions, comments?
I'm done nitpicking now.
Please, go ahead.
No, I'm really,
Oh, you're
I'm done
nitpicking.
nitpicking.
Okay. Like you said, you're getting nitpicky.
No,
I'm like, well,
I'm
what have you
done.
been doing?
Yeah, no.
I do have one
I'm being vulnerable, no.
No, that's great. Mr. Shorter?
I do have one question, because we know that there's sort of two different things that are under Ed Choice. You have the vouchers, and you have scholarships. Should we include that language in there? I mean, is it just enough to say vouchers? Because the scholarships are what's really hammering us, or will, and those scholarships, they're not really classified the same as vouchers, because those will go to any child in that high school range, even the affluent. So it's a scholarship. And I think when I was reading the Ed Choice materials, I thought they did make a difference. Like the voucher, that is that traditional money that the state would sort of stroke a check to cover without taking that money from the public schools. The scholarships is kind of distinct, because there is no income requirement with it, and it is classified as a scholarship specifically. I think we probably need to have scholarship added in there in addition to voucher, because I think they're two different things.
The way the resolution's written makes, I wouldn't have read it that way. We're just at the very top, resolution opposing the State of Ohio Ed Choice Scholarship, and then parentheses voucher program, the very first.
I know, but there are two separate.
Okay, yeah.
Well, there are, and I don't know if anybody has their Ed Choice fact sheets here or the information from the State Department here, but
Yeah.
my understanding, there are two ways to qualify for what I believe the state was calling scholarships.
Okay.
All of it. One was to have a certain level of income that was, and I don't recall, it seems like 200%
Yeah.
of the federal
Right.
poverty level. Your income qualifies you, irrespective of the performance of the school. That qualifies you for what I thought they were calling an Ed Choice scholarship. I was not aware that that had a different name. Now, I think they chose the word scholarship because it has a better connotation than voucher. I think it was who can be against scholarships?
I thought there was something.
It really, but it is a voucher system, is what it is. The other way that you qualify is by having what the state determines is an underperforming school. And the difference is that for the income-based vouchers, scholarships, whatever you'd like to call them, they do not penalize the local public schools. They do not, that's additional funding that's provided from and not taken from the local public schools.
But all the scholarships come from our funding.
If you qualify by virtue of the underperforming school, even though the child may never have attended that school and you never got any public funding for that child, they still take public funding for a child they never gave you any funding for and divert it into that voucher system. And that's the big problem here, is that they have chosen to reduce local public school funding and not replace it. The income-based one, and Belina, I don't know, to me, it's all vouchers. They can call it a scholarship if they want to, it's a voucher system. And I think they did that just because it has a better sound to it.
So you think they rolled the name of everything over into scholarship?
I don't, I'm not sure, Belina, but at the end of the day, it's a voucher system. Part of the voucher system, the state pays for directly with additional funding, and the one that is based on school performance, not your income, they penalize the local school district for that funding, and they reduce your local funding, even if they never gave you any funding in the first place for that child. That's the difference. Now, if we need to take a minute and figure out if one of them's called a voucher and one of them's called a scholarship, but the way this is written, it's intended to send the message that regardless of what you call it, it's a voucher system. And I believe that to be true. So I wasn't too worried about whether they call it a scholarship or a voucher. To me, logically, they're both vouchers. They're just different ways of qualifying, and one penalizes the local district financially and the other one does not.
So the other one does not divert money from the public schools.
And those are.
Well, they provide additional funding for those vouchers, as I understand it.
Okay. Mr. Smith?
Yeah, so the ODE is referring to the program as a whole as the Ed Choice Scholarship Program. And even if you click on their fact sheet, it talks about provides up to 60,000 state-funded scholarships to students who attend low-performing schools. So John's right. I mean, they are calling them scholarships because they don't want to call them vouchers. They are vouchers, but in their literature, they're referring to them as scholarships throughout their literature.
Is that for both types, Billy, both the income-based and for the performing?
Well, I know the
school-based?
low performing because that's what we spent most of our time on. Let me check.
I'm looking at Ohio Revised Code and Ohio Administrative Code right now, and they are using scholarship throughout that, even for the income-based.
Okay.
I think they call it all scholarships because they like that word better.
Yeah.
It has better connotation. Who can be against a scholarship?
I see what you're saying, yeah.
Pardon me, I'm looking at the ODE's website, and I think the income-based one they're now calling the Ed Choice Expansion Program,
Yeah.
but still calling it a scholarship.
Well, I think we're getting conflicting information here then, if I heard Mandy correctly.
No, that's correct. The Ed Choice expansion is the income-based program, but they still refer to it as a scholarship even in ORC.
I think they're both vouchers, and I'm comfortable with that word. And I think we should call it what it is, because that's important. I think there's some misleading, the word scholarship misleads people to think of something positive as opposed to a voucher system, which I think the state has received quite a bit of criticism over the vouchers, so they decided to call it something else.
So voucher/scholarships is not something you want to do? You want to?
Well, we called it what the state
Yeah.
called it, so there would be no confusion about.
Yeah.
In the
It
headline.
says Ohio Ed Choice Scholarship, and then I put word voucher.
In parentheses, sure.
Just to
Yeah.
let them know that we know what it is.
So we're referencing
Yeah.
that throughout the rest of the document.
That's fine. Okay, I'm good with that. That's.
Does anybody else have any concerns or comments?
The only comment I have is I attended a meeting with Mr. Smith and Mrs. Lane and Mrs. Shorter, and just walked out of there shaking my head at this, and just have to hope that if this was ever well-intended, that these legislators will revisit this, because I don't think this is what they had in mind. And bringing 1,000 new school buildings into this program can't be what they intended. So I certainly commend you for being at the forefront of this and working so hard to bring it to their attention in a way that hopefully makes them rethink this sooner rather than later.
I also want to commend the efforts that Mrs. Shorter has done. Every time I turn around, I see something else written by her, informing the public about what this is. And I'm not sure how she finds the time to do it, because it's just so much that you're doing. So thank you so much. In every conversation that I've had with any kind of legislator, state representative, or senator, to me, it sounds like they weren't even sure what they were voting on. They weren't sure, like, well, how's that possible that it's affecting you that way? I'm like, well, that's the way it's written, that's what's going to happen. And so hopefully, if they're being honest, things will start moving favorably in our direction. I'm not counting on it. I did read one quote in the paper by one of our senators that said this is good for public schools because it'll bring more families into your district to take advantage of the voucher program. It's like, okay, it's going to increase property values, and I'm still trying to see how labeling a school underperforming is going to help property values. So I don't believe that 1 minute. So this is very important. I thank you for the due diligence to get this out quickly, because we need to act on it quickly. So I think when we go to vote on it, I guess we need to reread it with the changes that we've made. I don't know if you've made notes of that, or
I believe.
or do we just need to say which changes made? Do we, Mr. Clemens?
I've got the changes kind of scribbled off here.
So do we need to reread that, or
Well,
do
I
you
think
just?
those 2 paragraphs would be sufficient. That's 3 paragraphs that changes, that's all.
So we could, when it comes time, we could make a motion to approve with changes indicated, because,
Yeah, the motion could be to approve the agenda or the resolution
as revised. Okay.
I can run through the changes quickly if you'd like.
Let's just do that, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, because this is very important.
Yeah, in the last paragraph on the first page, it would read, whereas private parochial schools accepting students with public tax vouchers would not be required to accept all students, but would be permitted to retain their selective admission policies without enforcement of other laws applicable to public schools. And then it goes to the top of the next page, whereas private parochial school students are not subject to the testing standards required of public school students, so that the actual performance of private parochial schools subsidized with public tax dollars will not be known relative to equivalent public school evaluation standards. And then it goes on from there. And then in the second paragraph, where it says, "Be it further resolved that this board opposes any funding programs, vouchers, or otherwise that have the effect of diverting public tax dollars from public schools to private parochial schools." The word "or" is removed.
Is everybody comfortable with that?
Yes.
Okay,